Doesn't this all remind you of 2003? Quick victories, imminent threats, we know what we're doing. The last time we heard that, it cost $3 trillion and produced 20 years of chaos. Trump, buoyed by Venezuela, may have walked into a trap that's been a decade in the making. In 36 hours, the market's open. Let's talk about what happens next with dollar and U.S. Step back, far back. Look at the map, the Persian Gulf, 21% of the world's liquid petroleum moving through a choke point 33 miles wide at its narrowest, 40,000 American military personnel within strike range of Iranian ballistic missiles, 2 carrier strike groups, 16 surface warships, 108 air tankers in the sky, keeping 40 to 50% of all deployable U.S. combat air power aloft simultaneously. This is the largest American military deployment in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and it's happening on a Saturday. That detail matters because while you're watching this, U.S. financial markets are closed. The New York Stock Exchange doesn't open until Monday, 9:30 a.m. Eastern. But markets never truly sleep. Bitcoin, the asset that doesn't wait for regulators, that cannot be told to halt trading, that processes the world's fear in real time, has already moved. It dropped to $63,000 in the hours after the strikes were confirmed. Not because crypto has anything to do with Iranian centrifuges, but because Bitcoin is one of the only honest price signals available on a Saturday morning when Wall Street is running dark. Think of it as a lie detector that nobody can turn off. You were told this would be quick. You were told Iran was a clear and present danger to the American homeland. You were told the nuclear program would be obliterated. We already heard every single one of those words in 2003. On Monday at 9:30 a.m., the dollar will also meet reality. Let me take you back 8 months. June 2025. The United States and Israel execute a 12-day military operation, Operation Midnight Hammer, targeting Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan. The stated objective? Destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The public declaration afterward from the President of the United States, Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated. 8 months later, the U.S. intelligence community is reporting that Iran has reconstituted its capabilities, not partially, aggressively. Intelligence assessments show approximately 400 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium, enough material for 10 to 11 nuclear devices, stockpiled and increasingly protected inside hardened facilities. Let that land. The program that was obliterated in June 2025 had to be struck again at massively greater scale in February 2026. Now here is where I want you to think carefully, because this is where the official narrative and the independent analytical record begin to diverge violently. The Trump administration justified Operation Epic Fury, this second, far larger campaign, by claiming Iran was actively building missiles that would soon reach the United States of America. The phrase used was imminent threat to the homeland. Imminent. The Defense Intelligence Agency, not an Iranian think tank, not a European NGO, the DIA, the United States Defense Intelligence Agency, published an assessment in 2025 concluding that Iran would require a minimum of 10 years of uninterrupted development until approximately 2035 to field an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching North American territory. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence's own annual threat assessment did not classify Iran's ballistic missile program as a direct military threat to the U.S. homeland. 10 years. Not soon, not imminent. This gap between the executive's public claim and the intelligence community's documented finding is not a minor discrepancy. It is a structural echo of the most consequential intelligence fabrication in modern American history. In 2002 and 2003, the Bush administration told the American public and the United Nations Security Council that Saddam Hussein possessed active weapons of mass destruction programs. The DIA had already internally flagged significant skepticism about the sourcing of those claims. We know how that story ended: a $3 trillion war, 100,000 Iraqi civilian deaths by conservative estimates, and a strategic vacuum that gave birth to ISIS. Operation Shock and Awe, Operation Epic Fury, even the naming convention rhymes. But here's the strategic problem that every serious analyst I respect keeps returning to. Airstrikes do not change regimes. They consolidate them. The political science research on this point is remarkably consistent. When a state is attacked from the outside, a particular psychological phenomenon occurs within the general population, even a population that deeply resents its own government. The external enemy becomes the unifying force. The internal grievance gets subordinated to national survival. We saw this in real time during the very 2025 strikes that preceded this campaign. Iran experienced massive anti-government protests driven by economic collapse, by engineered dollar shortages, by a rial in freefall. And yet, when the bombs fell in June 2025, Iranians did not rise up to overthrow the clerical establishment. They went to shelters. They buried their dead. They waited for the bombs to stop. Now multiply that. The 2026 campaign is exponentially larger. Decapitation strikes near the Supreme Leader's residence. The annihilation of the Iranian Navy. This is not a targeted surgical strike. This is a message about regime survival. You do not achieve regime change from 30,000 feet. You achieve it with ground forces, with occupation, with 100,000 troops and a 10-year nation-building project that costs conservatively what the last one cost, $3 trillion. And here is the question no administration official has answered on camera. Does the United States have a plan for the day after? Because right now, there is no universally recognized Iranian government in exile. There is no organized opposition coalition with legitimacy and geographic reach. There is no identified successor structure. The administration's implicit bet is that the Iranian population, simultaneously absorbing the largest aerial bombardment since the Gulf War and learning that their supreme leader's compound has been struck, will spontaneously produce a pro-American political transition. That is not a strategy. That is a wish. And wishes, historically, are not a sound basis for a Middle East policy. Before the first bomb fell on February 28th, the United States macroeconomy was already under significant pressure. The Supreme Court struck down the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEPA, which had been the legal basis for the most aggressive tariff regime in American history. Average effective tariff rates had briefly hit 16%, a level not seen in nearly a century. After the court ruling, the administration pivoted to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, implementing a flat 15% tariff on all imports. All imports. The Peterson Institute for International Economics had already forecast that tariff pass-through alone, before any military conflict, could add 50 basis points to headline inflation by mid-2026. The January Producer Price Index, released days before the strikes, came in at 0.5% monthly growth, well above forecasts. Core inflation jumped 0.8% in a single month. That was the baseline. Now layer on the oil shock. By February 27th, one day before the strikes, Brent crude was already trading at $73 per barrel on conflict speculation alone. The Energy Information Administration had projected an average of $58 per barrel for all of 2026. The Strait of Hormuz. This is the 33-mile-wide choke point between Iran and Oman, through which approximately 21% of the world's liquid petroleum transits every single day, between 13 and 18 million barrels per day. Saudi crude, Qatari LNG, Emirati oil. The Center for Strategic and International Studies modeled 4 escalation scenarios, and I want to walk through each one because the numbers are not theoretical. They map directly to what you pay per gallon. Scenario 1. Iran targets Karg Island, the terminal through which roughly 90% of Iranian crude exports flow. Result: 1.6 million barrels per day removed from global supply. Price impact: $10 to $12 above baseline. We're around $85 a barrel. Scenario 2. Iran begins systematic harassment of commercial shipping through the strait. Mines, drone boats, IRGC naval interdiction of non-Iranian tankers. Result: severe throttling of up to 18 million barrels per day of regional output. Price impact: crude climbs past $90 per barrel. Scenario 3. Direct Iranian strikes on production and processing facilities, not just Iranian ones, but regional ones. Saudi Aramco's Abqaiq facility, the largest petroleum processing complex on Earth, has been struck before, in 2019. Price impact at this level: above $100 per barrel. Scenario 4. Full regional conflagration. Iranian proxy activation across Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Sustained disruption to 18 million barrels per day of regional output. Price impact: near or exceeding $130 per barrel. The EIA had forecast U.S. retail gasoline at roughly $2.90 per gallon for 2026. At $80 to $90 crude, the national average breaches $3 per gallon. At $130 crude, we are looking at $4.50 to $5 at the pump. Now combine that with the 15% tariff on all imports, which includes everything from consumer electronics to food inputs to automobile parts. The result is a textbook stagflationary environment: rising prices, slowing growth, a Federal Reserve caught between 2 impossible options: raise rates to fight inflation and trigger a recession, hold rates and let inflation run above 4%. Analysts looking at the combined effect, expanding fiscal deficits already exceeding 7% of GDP, a tightening labor market, the tariff baseline, and the energy shock, are projecting U.S. inflation above 4% by end of 2026. You pay for this war twice: once as a taxpayer, funding the missiles, the carrier strike groups, the 108 air tankers keeping 40,000 troops supplied across the theater, and again as a consumer, at the gas station, at the grocery store, on your utility bill this winter. The Dow Jones dropped 800 points on February 27th, before the first bomb fell. The S&P 500 down 0.78%. The NASDAQ down nearly 1%. That was the market pricing in the possibility of war. Monday morning will price in the reality of it. There's a subplot to this story that most coverage has either missed entirely or buried in a paragraph. On February 27th, the same day markets were sliding, the same day the carrier groups were running final pre-strike sequences, the United States Department of Defense issued a formal demand to the AI company Anthropic. The demand was specific: grant the military unfettered access to Anthropic's Claude AI model and remove the safety guardrails, specifically the restrictions prohibiting use for mass domestic surveillance and autonomous lethal weapons systems. Dario Amodei, Anthropic's CEO, refused publicly. The response from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was immediate. Anthropic was officially designated a supply chain risk to national security. A $200 million federal defense contract was canceled. Federal agencies were given a 6-month deadline to phase out all Anthropic technology. I've spent 10 years watching governments and corporations negotiate the boundaries of state power over private technology. I have never seen anything move this fast or this bluntly. What you are watching is a wartime government using the emergency logic of conflict to accelerate the absorption of private AI infrastructure into the national security state. The war in Iran is the lever. The real prize is the technology. This matters for the economy in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The AI sector is currently one of the primary drivers of U.S. equity valuations. The 5 largest AI-adjacent companies account for a disproportionate share of S&P 500 market capitalization. When the government begins designating private AI firms as national security risks and canceling their federal contracts, not because of performance failures, but because of refusal to remove ethical constraints, the signal to the entire venture capital and institutional investment ecosystem is seismic. What other company, handed a government contract worth hundreds of millions, might next be told, remove your safety architecture or lose everything? And there's a second, more technical knock-on effect. Qatar is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It is also the host nation for the Al Udeid Air Base, one of the primary U.S. installation targets of Iranian retaliatory strikes. If Qatari LNG exports are disrupted, either through direct Iranian action or through Qatar's own political recalculation of its position, the effect cascades directly into U.S. energy markets. And American data centers run on electricity. The AI infrastructure boom, the GPU clusters, the server farms, the hyperscale facilities being built across Texas, Virginia, and the Mountain West, runs on enormous amounts of cheap baseload power. If natural gas prices spike due to LNG supply disruption, the operating costs of American AI infrastructure spike with them. The war you're watching in the Strait of Hormuz has a fiber optic cable running directly to the GPU farm your favorite AI company is running in Virginia. There is always, in any conflict, a party that benefits without paying. Let me show you the map again, this time broader, much broader. While the United States is deploying 40 to 50% of its total deployable air combat power to the Persian Gulf theater, while American carrier groups are burning through operational budgets at wartime rates, while American diplomatic capital is being spent at scale, alienating European allies who were not consulted, while American households are about to absorb a simultaneous tariff shock and energy shock, 2 nations are watching this from an enormous strategic distance. Beijing, Moscow. They are not neutral. They have interests, and those interests are being served quietly by every additional hour this conflict continues. Here is the mechanism. The BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus a growing roster of invited members, including Iran, has spent the better part of a decade constructing the institutional architecture for a post-dollar trade system. The Asian Clearing Union, whose 51st meeting was hosted in Tehran, has been explicitly developing non-dollar settlement mechanisms. China has been expanding yuan-denominated oil contracts, the so-called petro-yuan, with Gulf state producers. These were slow, structural, decades-long projects, infrastructure work, unglamorous, unfinished. Then the United States Treasury Secretary gave them the single most powerful marketing tool imaginable, Scott Bessent, in a moment of remarkable candor, acknowledged that Washington had deliberately engineered a dollar shortage within the Iranian economy, using the dollar's status as the global reserve currency as an offensive financial weapon to collapse the rial and destabilize the Iranian government from within. That admission was not just a confession about Iran policy. It was a message to every nation on earth that maintains dollar reserves, that settles its energy trade in dollars, that holds U.S. Treasury bonds as its sovereign wealth backstop. The message was, we will use the dollar as a weapon against you if your interests diverge from ours. Now ask yourself, if you are the finance minister of a nation that is not firmly in the American geopolitical orbit, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, and you heard that, what do? You diversify. Slowly, carefully, quietly, but you begin moving. The BRICS bloc formally condemned the strikes on Iran as a violation of international law. That condemnation represents more than half the world's population and a growing share of global GDP. Russia and China are not spending a single soldier or a single yuan on this conflict. They are watching the United States exhaust itself, spend its resources, and accelerate the process of eroding the very financial infrastructure that underpins American hegemony. An adversary depleting its own empire while you drink tea is not a coincidence. It is, for strategists in Beijing and Moscow, an outcome they have been patient enough to simply wait for. The petro-yuan doesn't need to win. The petrodollar just needs to look unreliable. Operation Epic Fury and the Treasury's admission that preceded it may have done more for Chinese financial ambitions than any number of bilateral yuan settlement agreements. What happens on Monday? It's Saturday as I'm recording this. The strikes began early this morning. The retaliation has already begun. Iranian ballistic missiles have struck Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, Al Salem in Kuwait, and the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, simultaneously. For the first time in the conflict's history, the theater of Iranian retaliation is not limited to Israel. It spans the entire Gulf. 40,000 American military personnel are within range of that missile architecture. Bitcoin is at $63,000. Wall Street is closed, and the clock is running toward Monday, 9:30 a.m. Eastern. Let me lay out, factually and without embellishment, what the analytical consensus expects to happen when markets open. The oil gap. Futures markets will open Sunday evening. The spread between Friday's closing price and what traders have been pricing in through weekend derivative activity will become visible. If Iranian interdiction of Hormuz shipping traffic has escalated over the weekend, even partially, even through drone harassment rather than direct blockade, the move in crude is unlikely to be incremental. Markets price abrupt geopolitical discontinuities in spikes, not gradual adjustments. The equity reaction. The Dow dropped 800 points on Friday before the war was confirmed. That was anticipation pricing. Monday morning will price the reality. A multi-theater conflict with no defined endpoint, with retaliatory strikes on U.S. bases, with a government that has simultaneously imposed a 15% tariff on all imports and is now burning operational budgets at wartime rates, while fiscal deficits already exceed 7% of GDP. The dollar question. The Treasury's admission of engineered currency warfare is now in the public record. Foreign central banks that have been watching quietly will begin, at the margin, reassessing their dollar exposure. This is not a 2008 moment. It is a slow tectonic shift. But tectonic shifts, over time, reshape landscapes. Beijing and Moscow will make statements. They will be measured, careful, and precisely calibrated to signal solidarity with the BRICS condemnation of the strikes without triggering a direct confrontation. The goal is not to escalate. The goal is to make the American position look isolated, to let the arithmetic of exhaustion work on its own timeline. Now let me offer you the Iraq comparison one final time, because I think it is the most clarifying analytical frame available. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq with a plan for the war and, famously, almost no plan for the peace. The Pentagon's post-war planning was inadequate. The de-Baathification policy dissolved the Iraqi military and security apparatus overnight, creating a massive pool of trained, armed, humiliated men with no institutional affiliation, who subsequently became the backbone of the insurgency. The cost? An estimated $3 trillion. The strategic outcome? The removal of the only functioning counterweight to Iranian regional influence in the Gulf, dramatically expanding Tehran's geopolitical reach. The 2003 Iraq War, in strategic retrospect, was one of the greatest gifts to Iranian regional ambitions in modern history. Operation Epic Fury is larger in scope, more aggressive in its targeting, and, critically, being executed without a ground force, without a transition plan, without an identified successor government, and without any serious allied coalition. The administration has claimed it can achieve what the 2003 campaign could not achieve, using fewer resources in less time from the air alone. The $3 trillion question is not whether this succeeds militarily in the short term. American air power is technologically unmatched. Targets are being destroyed. Iranian air defense is being degraded. The $10 trillion question, and I use that number not as a precise estimate, but as a scale marker, is what comes after. What fills the vacuum if the Iranian regime collapses? What happens to the nuclear material? 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium scattered across hardened facilities in a post-regime power vacuum. What is the cost of a decade of insurgency, of proxy retaliation, of regional instability, of sustained energy price disruption to an American economy already running stagflationary risks? What is the cost in dollar confidence, in reserve currency premium, in petrodollar architecture of the world watching the United States simultaneously wage an elective war and use its currency as a weapon? I have spent 10 years watching governments make decisions that look decisive in the moment and reckless in retrospect. The data I've walked you through today, the DIA's 10-year ICBM timeline, the Hormuz choke point scenarios, the 15% tariff baseline, the Anthropic precedent, the Treasury's dollar weaponization admission, the BRICS condemnation, the $800 point Friday drop. None of these are projections. They are documented facts. What you do with them is your decision. But Monday is coming. At 9:30 a.m., the market opens, and reality, as it always does, will price itself in. One question before you go. Is this 2003, or is it different this time? Drop a year in the comments. 2003, if you think we've seen this movie before. 2026, if you think Trump actually has a plan. I'll be reading every reply.